Today, I want to welcome Danny Nathan. He's the founder and CEO of Apollo Ventures. Apollo is a really interesting company that's a little hard to define at first, but when Danny explained it to me, it made sense. And basically, companies get to a point where they're kind of stuck and they need some innovation. They have trouble innovating within themselves. And so they bring in folks like Danny to help them break through that place that they're stuck, spice up their product offering, and open up new revenue opportunities. And typically, they do this for businesses that are 10 million and up. And so, the reason I think you should listen today is whatever revenue you're at. Let's say you're below 10 million, you will reach a point where you're going to start stagnating and you're going to run into these blockades. And so, I think this is an important episode to listen to because I think we're going to learn some really interesting things about how to break through that. So, Danny, welcome.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
So, you're up in Brooklyn, and I mentioned that I was in Austin. You're like, oh, I went to grad school there, and so you came, of course, to the University of Austin at Texas, or as Texas at Austin, and very obviously down here held in high esteem. There is no better.
Of
Um,
course.
but you got a master's in advertising,
I did.
but you don't do advertising.
No, I don't. I got my master's in advertising, immediately moved to New York, the mecca of all things advertising, and spent about a whopping 2 years in the world of advertising. And to be quite frank, just never enjoyed it. It never scratched the itch for me, and I came to the conclusion that the most fun one will ever have in advertising is during ad school. And really, it all came to a head for me. I remember the meeting. I can tell you the day that I mentally checked out of the world of advertising. And I'll try and keep it brief, but my partner and I were called into a meeting with our executive creative director and the chief strategy officer or something. And we were working on Mrs. Butterworth's syrup, which, if you'll recall, is the one that the bottle is the shape of Mrs. Butterworth. And they sat us down and gave us this whole rundown about how our recent TV spots where the bottle animates to life and talks to little Jimmy while he's at the breakfast table and mom's cooking pancakes in the background is the utter epitome of this brand. And they had brought us into the meeting because we had $1 million budget to create a game for kids online. And I couldn't. I mean, you have $1 million to spend. They sat there and talked about all of the ideas that had come up previously, and the best one that was on the table was Where's Waldo with a syrup bottle in it. And I'd been sitting there for what must have been about 45 minutes. And I don't think I've said two words, clearly starting to annoy, my bosses. They're kind of giving me the side eye of like, hey, chime in, contribute, it's time. And so I finally, sort of raised my hand and said, okay, let me get this straight. We have $1 million to work with, right? Yes. And we want to engage with kids for whom the talking bottle is the epitome of the brand, right? Yes. I said, cool. Why don't we put talking bottles on the shelves of grocery stores so that when kids pop the top of the syrup bottle, it says something to them and they get the exact same experience that we've just created TV commercials for? Room went dead silent, felt like an eternity. It was probably, a couple of seconds. And finally, my creative director looks at me and says, but that's package design. That's outside of our purview. And just bombed, like dead silence, mental bombshell going. I was just like, oh my God, I just can't anymore. I cannot do this for the rest of my life. In what world is the thing that you just told me is the epitome of the brand not in our purview? And so now I don't work in advertising anymore.
That is so wild. And when you were talking about that, about a video game, the thing that hit me was, I wonder how many kids buy the sauce,
Right, the pancake syrup.
buy
Who's
the
the
pancake,
Yeah, who's the decision maker in the household?
and you remember a few years ago, 6, 7 years ago, um, Old Spice ran this ad, look at your man now, look at me now, look at your
Yeah,
man.
yeah.
So if you go through that ad, I actually know a lot about that ad. if you go through that ad, they the ad is targeted at a woman, the person who is most likely going to buy Old Spice.
Right.
Um, and they're sitting there actively insulting her husband. Your husband doesn't look like me, but you wish he did. But guess what? He can smell like me. And it was a brilliant strategy. And there's some other stuff that I won't say on there. The ad's like, go back and look at that ad as just straight up pornography. And when you look at it from a perspective of straight up pornography, you'll see things in that ad. You're like, oh, wow. And so basically, that ad was targeting undersexed housewives.
Yep.
But that's who bought, that's who they
Yeah, that's who
realized
was
to buy.
deciding what a man needed to smell like.
And it was outrageously successful. They it was a Super Bowl ad. By the end of the year, they were number one in body wash and male body wash.
Hmm.
And by the 1 year anniversary of that, they had doubled sales. It was
Oh my God.
outrageously successful. But they were targeting the person who was going to buy it, the purchaser.
Right.
And that's what struck me about your Mrs. Butterworth's. It's like, you're going to spend all that money to make a video game for kids
Right.
who
Yeah, I
don't buy
can.
your syrup.
Yeah, I can kind of get behind the argument of, mom might not care what brand of syrup, and if Jimmy's begging for Mrs. Butterworth, then she'll grab that one next time. But your point is very well taken, and I agree. The whole effort was sort of misguided, as I've relayed.
Yeah. Well, and it's kind of interesting that kind of dovetails into what you help people do is, one thing that you see in very mature and established brands is they get stuck,
Hmm.
and they get stuck in this mentality of, hey, this is how we've done it. This is what's led us to our success so
Yes.
far. And I imagine there was some of that going on with Mrs. Buttersworth. They just had been focused on the same thing so long, they lost fresh ideas.
Right.
And um, and so that kind of ties into what Apollo Ventures does. And this, we're not doing an ad here, but I'm really intrigued by what Apollo Ventures does. It's, so I gave my description. How would you describe it?
So Apollo 21 and our kind of sister company, Apollo 21 Ventures, basically sit in the realm of venture building. So we are a company that is designed around the idea of applying repeatable processes to grow and build companies and the new products that will make those companies well known. And so we work with, as you nodded to, mid to enterprise size customers who are looking for scale and growth and an opportunity to reinvigorate the entrepreneurial spirit and the innovation that really drives companies when they're small. And so if you look at the sort of general life cycle of a company, as you've pointed out rightly, you start off as the disruptive startup who then takes market share from the incumbent, the big company, and eventually you settle. You go, okay, this is working. Let's keep doubling down on this. And what you end up doing is effectively washing away all of the innovative thinking and the ability to look for those unique, contrarian, just sort of on the fringe ideas that allow you to tap into new market share, allow you to discover new business models, or come up with new products that solve pain points for your customers. And so, we look at it and we think about why didn't Blockbuster start Netflix? Or why didn't the Hilton or Hyatt or Marriott start Airbnb? Things of that sort. And it really comes down to getting too stuck in the rut of business as usual.
Yeah. Yeah. So what what do you think contributes to that? You laid out some of it, but I can picture people saying, they're listening and they're like, I'm not stuck. I have an open mind. I would imagine all these people that are stuck claim that they have an open mind.
Yes, everybody believes in innovation and everybody wants to be innovative. And it's really where the rubber hits the road that you have to start questioning whether or not you are structurally and culturally set up to fulfill on that need. And you're asking, Craig, kind of what leads to it. In my mind, it has to do with really the way that businesses are structured today and the way that we measure what success looks like for businesses. So, generally success is you're a publicly traded company, which means that you are beholden to whatever is the highest benefit for your shareholders, and you're beholden to a very clear set of metrics by which your business is measured that determine that you are doing a great job of conserving capital, that you are optimizing for efficiency in all of your processes, and that you're mitigating risk in everything that you do so that you can drive costs as low as possible and profits as high as possible. And the unfortunate reality is that innovation, the idea of coming up with something that is new and disruptive and unique, is inherently a cost center. It's not going to provide a return on your investment in the short period of time, the quarters or fiscal years that companies are looking for. It's going to take longer, and it's going to return ideally outsized returns, but it's going to take a lot of tries to get to the point where those outsized returns happen. And so when you look at what it means to innovate through that lens, in my mind, it suddenly becomes quite clear how you get to that point, because that's what everything is geared towards today that defines what a successful company looks like.
Yeah. Well, and there's some massive examples that, from me, from my background, the most notable example is Nokia mobile phones.
Yep.
Nokia had 50% market share.
Hmm.
At their peak, they had 50% market share. And the iPhone came out, and the story that I've heard, and I was in that industry, the story I heard was the head of Nokia mobile phones took the iPhone. He was in a staff meeting with his senior staff, and he threw the phone across the room and smashed it on the wall. And he said, "We should have built that. Get started." And they got started, but
Yeah.
they had all the money they needed. They had all they had all the momentum they needed. And they just started not so slowly dying.
Hmm.
I think I think it was 2010 when they sold to Microsoft. And so the iPhone came out in 2007.
Right.
So it took 3 years to take somebody from number one in the market to being sold to Microsoft, which was a disaster, and then completely disappearing from the market.
Right. Yeah, it's so interesting. And there's so many of those stories. I mean, the other one that popped into my head as you were describing that is, of course, Kodak and digital cameras.
Yeah.
No, nobody's going to want digital cameras. Why would anybody want that? Well,
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I experienced it. I remember, so I used to do semiconductors for mobile phones. And I was having a meeting with our engineering managers talking about next generation of parts, what could we do? And I kid you not, he looked at me and said, "Craig, our customers love our parts. They're always going to buy them. You're too worried."
wonder if wonder what he would think about that statement today.
Well, what was funny was I went back in my office and let my blood pressure come back down. And and a little bit later, I walked down to my our general manager's office, and I said, "Joe," I said, "I'm a little bit worried. I think our competitors is hungrier." I named one specific competitor. I said, "I think they're hungrier than us." And he got angry with me and threw me out of his office. Not kidding. Threw me out of his
Wow.
office. And within 9 months of that conversation, we had to deploy one of our most valuable assets, not in a strategic role, purely in a tactical role, basically to grab Samsung by the ankles and beg them to not design us out.
Interesting. And did they? I can only assume that.
We hung on to some of the business, not all. I mean,
Yeah.
but it came at a high cost. And guess what? The guy that we deployed to Korea ended up leaving the company
To go to
because guess what?
Samsung?
Uh, no, 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 no. He he moved to the UK at the
Got
time.
it.
But Samsung's a tough customer. Um, living if unless you're Asian, living in Asia can be tough. It's a different lifestyle.
Yeah.
Um, And, and at some point he just fed up. I mean, so you look at the total cost of that, and it goes back to people got complacent. They quit innovating. And so that's why I love what Apollo 21 does. I mean, that's just so cool. So when you go in, how do you break through this? Because here's the problem. The that mindset is still there.
Hmm.
So when Apollo 21 shows up, it's not like the mindset disappears.
No.
That mindset's still there. I mean, I don't envy you. That job sucks. How do you work through that?
Um, there's a couple of things that we do. One, we prepare ourselves for those conversations, and we've been through them ideally enough times at this point that we can help shed some light on why that change in thinking needs to happen. And we also have a bit of a rule for ourselves. If the need for change and for lack of better terms, if the edict of we're going to focus on innovation in this manner doesn't come from the top down, then to be frank, we're generally quite reluctant to work with that client and have been known to say no, thank you, because we know that without that support from the very highest levels of that organization, innovation is not going to happen. If you don't have the support of your executives and your C-suite in particular, who understand that this type of work requires different processes, different approaches, different frameworks, then there's no way that you're going to shoehorn an innovative culture into a company that is still executionally focused as opposed to learning focused.
Yeah. Well, that's such an interesting differentiation. Executionally focused versus learning focused.
Yes, that's one that we talk a lot about. In my experience, companies that are larger companies tend to be focused on execution. That's what they're good at. So companies as they grow and then become established and figure out what that product market fit looks like, they design all of their internal operations around the success of that thing. And so they become very good at executing at the limits of what they can do to increase their margins or what they can do to decrease delivery times, whatever the case may be. Whereas organizations that are focused on innovation have to have this learning mindset. There has to be a mindset going into it of what don't we know that will allow for an opportunity that we haven't thought of before. And it comes back to what I was describing a moment ago. Learning costs money, and uh, becoming operationally efficient saves money. And the two, in many ways, are at direct odds with one another.
Yeah. Well, that brings in another example that's really interesting. We talked about the iPhone, and under
Mhm.
Steve Jobs was an innovator. And one of the most curious things is when Steve Jobs dies, the person they put in charge is an operations guy.
Yes.
And I don't, one, I'm interested. What's your take on the Vision Pro headset?
I think that the Vision Pro is a really interesting look at what the future might bring to bear. It's also arguably, in many ways, a solution looking for a problem. And
Yeah.
I think a lot of it will depend on the ecosystem that grows up around the Vision Pro, because there's a few ways to look at it. If you're building for example, a remote workforce who wants to feel like they're not remote, awesome. Some really interesting features built around that. If you are building for somebody to have their own kind of personal entertainment room that goes with them wherever they go, interesting. Some really cool stuff that can enable that. But beyond that, I struggle to see the I struggle to see the widespread applications in ways that will make the Vision Pro the next iPhone.
Yeah.
And it's really interesting because when you brought up the iPhone a minute ago, I had this thought of, was the iPhone actually the last really game-changing thing that Apple launched? And I didn't think in the moment about the Vision Pro, but I don't really feel like, even now that you've brought it up, that the Vision Pro kind of lives up to that type of hype. It's not the same impactful game changer that first the iPod was, and then the iPhone, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, the iPad came out in 2010.
Oh God.
And and that's the product that turned me into an Apple user. I'm a PC guy. To this day, I'm a PC guy.
Oh, interesting.
And I got my first I got my first iPhone 3 years ago.
Okay.
And that was for different reasons. But um, originally, I got the HP, or which was who made that? That was Palm Pilot. It was Palm Pilot. Then they got acquired by HP. HP owned them for a year and like, we just want to waste another $1 billion, so they wrote off that business. And but the so then I went and got an iPad, and I tell you what, pried out my cold dead fingers. It was a game changer,
Hmm.
because in my mind it solved a problem. I haven't been able to figure out the problem that the Vision Pro solved.
What was the problem that the iPad solved for you so well?
Lightweight computing without toting around a heavy computer.
Gotcha.
Which is largely web browsing or reading books,
Yeah.
or if you had like, I put my presentations on there, and so, um, it was funny. I mean, so here's like, a story from my past. So when I was in semiconductors and you went and had a customer meeting, you brought your laptop, and the first thing you do is you flop open your laptop, and everybody that felt normal. And then I left the semiconductor world and started doing marketing for SMBs. And I noticed when I popped out my laptop, they just got nervous. They're like, wait a minute, this feels more formal than we were looking for. And so then I got my iPad, and they were okay if I was like, hey, man, I show you something on my iPad. That was okay.
That was okay.
That
That's where the
so
line fell.
yeah. Um, but when I look at what's happened to Apple, and so obviously Steve Jobs had the pipeline filled with a number of things, but
Hmm.
like the first product that came out under Apple, under Tim Cook, was the Apple Watch. And that took them like 3 generations before they figured out they built a fitness device.
Yeah. Yeah. That's interesting. I didn't actually I got my first Apple Watch, I think it's Series 5. I
Yeah.
mean, I was, and I'm a diehard Apple user. Like, I haven't had a non-Apple computer, mobile device, whatever, since 2005 probably. And I didn't need notifications on my wrist because that was what it felt like. It was like, hey, we took the notification center and made it more annoying.
Right. Yeah.
So now it's not your phone in your pocket that's buzzing. Now it's on your wrist.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. But I guess, kind of anchoring it back to what we were talking about, if a company, and let me just go on the record, I think Apple laid an egg with the Vision Pro. I think it's I think it's going to go down in history. Do you remember like the anniversary edition Mac? This was right before Steve Jobs joined Apple. Um, it's
yeah.
it was a flat screen. It was like this little panel. It was $10,000. Nobody bought it.
Right.
$10,000 computer, personal computer in the 90s. Nobody bought it.
Yeah.
Um, and I think the Vision Pro is going to go down like the anniversary edition Mac. The benefit of the anniversary edition Mac is you had years of Steve Jobs to erase that memory.
Right.
And so I had to bring that back to your memory. But what I would say is, if somebody with the resources and the talent that Apple has can make that big of a mistake, and I think it is a big mistake, then you shouldn't be embarrassed if your much smaller company is also stuck and is having trouble innovating and
Oh,
figuring
of
out.
course. Yeah, no, I'm not. Look, it's in my it's in my best interest to agree with you, but I do wholeheartedly. Yes, companies get stuck all the time, and it's in a way it's a measure of success because if you have grown to the point where you have the ability to get stuck, then there's a good chance that you've done something right and you are stuck because you've been focused on continuing to do something right. And so you certainly can't fault somebody for doubling down on the thing that's working, but sometimes folks need a reminder that, hey, it's only going to work for so long. And no matter how good it feels today, at some point, you're going to want to be focused on what comes next.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's when you call Apollo 21. Um, so tell me a little bit about the process. What's the process of innovation look like for a company that is stuck?
Uh, we tend to focus very heavily on the customer development process and the opportunities that are brought to bear by learning from your customers. And it's one of those things where a lot of companies go, oh, well, we send surveys all the time. We talk to our customers. We know what they want. And the reality is that there's a difference between surveying your customers about their experience with your existing product or your customer service team or whatever it is versus literally asking them what their problems are that you might be in a position to help them solve. And so a lot of the work that we do is structured around, at least early on, helping companies engage with their customers from an inquisitive perspective that really does just ask open-ended questions of what are you, Mr. or Ms. Customer, dealing with that aligns to our business, but that we can help solve a pain point for in your world. And it takes a little bit of discovery and back and forth, and it takes a lot of trial and error to find those opportunities. But eventually, what happens is, you cast a wide net, and then over time, through those conversations, you begin to narrow in on what that most opportunistic pain point is, and then ultimately what a potential solution is. And the benefit of doing all of that legwork up front is that by the time you're ready to go and start making the thing that is the solution, you have talked to so many people about it and you have explained to them what you think your solution is going to be and gotten their response to it. You have minimized so much risk in the product development process through customer development that the, I don't know, 1 to 3 months that you spend talking to folks on the front end will save you at least that on the far side. And so we focus very heavily on that portion as part of our discovery work.
So, oh my goodness, there's so many things you said in there that I want to tap into too. But let me start with this. So I actually have a blog article up that talks about the folly of opinion surveys. And and one of the examples, so two examples I use in there is one, the focus group that tested the 1984 commercial,
Hmm.
the Apple's Epic commercial. Focus group flunked it, and the
Yeah,
board actually pulled funding for that commercial. And it was the only reason that commercial ran was because Steve Jobs was Steve Jobs.
right.
And but the other example, when you talk to enough customers, so Coke, when they introduced New Coke in 1984, they tested 200,000 people. There was no problem with the sample size. 200,000 people led them to the wrong answer. And so how do you guard against that?
Um, the thing that comes to mind and what you're nodding to is the old sort of faster horse mentality. If I talk to my customers and ask them what they want, they're going to tell me they want a faster horse. And my perspective on that is yes, they will. And that's a good thing because it is not the customer's job to envision what a faster horse might look like. It is your job as the person that is creating what you think is the faster horse. It is your customer's job to tell you that they want to get from A to B faster and yours to interpret that to mean that, huh, what if a horse wasn't a horse but was a box with an engine and four wheels instead of four legs? And then how do you convince people that there's value in that? Um, and so, you know, there's always a balancing act and there's always other measures beyond just the customer opinion that go into whether or not something is innovative, whether or not it will be successful. And so when we go through that customer development process, what we're looking for are ideas that we can rank not only on the desirability, but also on the feasibility, the alignment to that company's core operating needs and core, what they're known for. Will customers trust this from you? For example, you know, Coke owns, I mean, how many different brands of soda does Coca-Cola own? If New Coke had simply been introduced under a different brand name, 200,000 people might have been perfectly right. They just didn't want to replace what they knew as Coke. And so there's a lot of measures that you have to kind of take into consideration as you're going through that process to assess what exactly it is that you're learning from your customers.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and this ties into the other thing that I heard you say a number of times. When you're having these conversations, you're trying to figure out what their pain is.
Yes.
And I think, um, for me, I live in, I mean, it makes me just straight up nervous when I don't feel like I have clarity on the customer's pain, whether it's from me and my own marketing or me helping other people with their marketing.
Right.
I mean, I get really twitchy because the thing I've learned is when you miss the pains, when you miss the pains, you the outcome's not good. And I think
Yeah.
that's what happened with the Vision Pro. It didn't fix a pain.
Yeah.
Actually added one. It's heavy.
I haven't sat down and played with one yet, which obviously I need to do, but I I can't help but believe that the next iteration will be the make or break it. You know, can they
Yeah.
the Apple's pretty well known for getting the first one out relatively quickly. You know, certainly not software quickly, but when you're talking hardware, that's to be expected. Um, and it always takes them a little while to sort of iron out the kinks.
Yeah. Well, interesting. You know, Danny, I could keep going for a while. This is so fascinating. But unfortunately, we need to wrap.
Sure.
Um, so Apollo 21 is your company. How do people reach you?
We're pretty easy to find. We are Apollo21, number two, number one .io. I am personally on all of the socials as blah, blah, blah slash among many. And of course, Apollo21 is on most of the major social platforms as well. So please check us out. Give us a look. We have a bunch of case studies and some white papers and other documents and things that might actually provide useful if you work in the innovation space or in any kind of venture building operations. And then if you happen to be in the New York area, I run a monthly founders dinner and a monthly innovators dinner that is live and in person and very informal. And I love to find new folks to join us for dinner.
Oh, that's awesome. Well, Danny, thanks for being on Leaders and Legacies.
Thanks for having me. It's been a great chat.